Part 1. From Healers to Warriors, 11th–12th centuries. The story of the Knights of Malta begins not with battle, but with mercy. Long before they became the armored defenders of Christendom, the men who would one day call themselves the Knights Hospitaller began as caretakers, monks tending the sick and the poor in the Holy Land. It was the late 11th century. The world of medieval Europe was awakening from the so-called Dark Ages, filled with a new passion for faith, pilgrimage, and war. Jerusalem, the holiest city of all, lay in Muslim hands, ruled first by the Fatimids of Egypt, and later threatened by the Seljuk Turks. Yet thousands of Christian pilgrims still risked their lives to reach the sacred sites. Around 1048, merchants from the Italian city of Amalfi received permission from the Fatimid Caliph of Egypt to build a small hospice in Jerusalem, a hospital dedicated to Street John the Baptist. Its mission was simple: to care for poor and sick pilgrims of all faiths. The hospice was staffed by monks and lay brothers who lived by a rule of service and humility. They called themselves the Fratres Hospitalari Sancti, Ioannis Hierosolimitani, the brothers of the Hospital of Street John of Jerusalem. Then, in 1095, everything changed. At the Council of Clermont, Pope Urban II called on Christian knights to free Jerusalem from Muslim rule. The First Crusade was born. When the Crusaders captured the city in 1099, the small hospital stood amid the chaos, still caring for the wounded Muslims and Christians alike. Amid the blood and the fire, the Brothers of Street, John gained a powerful protector, Gerard Tom, known as Blessed Gerard, their founder and first master. He persuaded the new Latin rulers of Jerusalem that his brotherhood could serve both God and the Crusaders by tending to the sick and the needy. The newly established Kingdom of Jerusalem recognized the hospital's independence. Donations poured in from Europe, lands, money, and privileges that would soon transform this quiet brotherhood into something far greater. Within a generation, the Hospitallers evolved from caregivers into defenders. The Holy Land was surrounded by enemies, and the fragile Crusader states needed every sword they could raise. By 1120, under Gerard's successor Raymond Dupuy, the order adopted a dual mission: to care for the sick and to defend the faith. They began training in arms, building fortresses, and escorting pilgrims through dangerous passes. By 1136, the Pope officially recognized them as a military order equal to the Templars, who had recently emerged with a similar vow of martial service. The black robes of the Hospitallers were marked by a simple white cross, a symbol of purity and sacrifice. In battle, they wore armor beneath a red surcoat, emblazoned with the same cross that would one day become the emblem of Malta. Unlike most medieval armies, the Hospitallers were a disciplined international brotherhood. Knights from France, Italy, Spain, England, and Germany served under a single rule and answered directly to their Grand Master. They took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, yet wielded immense power. Their chain of command was rigid, their fortifications impressive, their faith unshakable. Throughout the 12th century, the Hospitallers became one of the great pillars of Crusader strength. They built and manned castles across the Levant Crac des Chevaliers in Syria, Margat, Belvoir, and many others. Crac des Chevaliers, perched high on a hill overlooking the Ham's Gap, was a marvel of medieval engineering, a double-walled fortress with towers, stores, stables, and even chapels. Arab chroniclers called it Hizan al-Akrad, the castle of the Kurds, but everyone knew it as the Hospitallers' invincible bastion. Inside its walls, life was a mix of prayer and war. The day began with Mass, then weapons practice. The brothers cared for pilgrims in the infirmary, treated the wounded after battles, and stood guard through the long nights. They fought not for personal glory, but as soldiers of Christ, though, in truth, their discipline and wealth made them a formidable political force in their own right. The order's reputation spread quickly across Europe. Monarchs granted them lands, castles, and privileges. Hospitaller priories sprang up from England to Hungary, each sending funds and recruits to the east. The Black Mantle, with its white cross, became one of the most respected and feared symbols of the Crusades. Yet, as the 12th century wore on, the tide began to turn. The Muslim world, once divided, found new unity under brilliant leaders like Nur ad-Din and later Salah ad-Din, Yusuf ibn Ayyub, known in the West as Saladin. When Saladin recaptured Jerusalem in 1187 after the disastrous Christian defeat at Hattin, the Hospitallers fought bravely but were overwhelmed. Many were killed, others taken prisoner, their hospitals destroyed, their castles besieged. The Hospitallers retreated north to the coastal city of Acre, the last major Christian stronghold in the Holy Land. Still, they refused to abandon their mission. From Acre, they continued to serve the sick and to fight in defense of the remaining Crusader territories. Their black and white banner, the Buisson, became a rallying point for Christian armies, a symbol of endurance amid loss. For 2 centuries, the Knights Hospitaller had grown from a handful of monks into a transnational military order. Their blend of compassion and ferocity made them unique, both healers and warriors, men who saw no contradiction in tending the wounded one day and charging into battle the next. They had lost Jerusalem, but their spirit endured. Soon they would find a new home, one that would make them lords, not of castles, but of the sea itself. Part 2. The Lords of the Sea, 13th, 16th centuries. When the last Crusader stronghold of Acre fell in 1291, the dream of a Christian Holy Land collapsed with it. The Templars and the Hospitallers, once the twin pillars of Crusader power, were forced to flee before the armies of Islam. For the Knights Hospitaller, this was not the end, but the beginning of a new chapter. They had lost Jerusalem and their hospitals in the east, but they still possessed their discipline, their faith, and their vast European estates. Their first refuge was the island of Cyprus, then ruled by the Lusignan kings, former Crusaders themselves. Yet Cyprus was too small, too crowded, and too dependent on politics to allow the Hospitallers full independence. They needed a home of their own, a fortress from which they could continue their sacred war and defend the Christian world. Their answer lay in the Aegean Sea, the island of Rhodes. The Knights take Rhodes. In 1306, under the leadership of Grandmaster Fulk de Viaret, the Hospitallers launched an audacious campaign to seize Rhodes from the Byzantine Empire. The conquest was not easy. It took 4 years of siege and battle before the island finally fell to them in 1310. But once it did, the Knights Hospitaller had their own sovereign state for the first time in history, independent of kings and popes alike. From the rocky cliffs of Rhodes, they built not just fortresses, but a fleet. They turned their new home into a naval citadel, a Christian stronghold facing the rising power of Islam across the sea. The order that once healed pilgrims now ruled trade routes, built ships, minted coins, and governed people. By the mid-14th century, the Knights of Street, John of Jerusalem, of Rhodes, and of Malta, as they would later be called, had transformed into a maritime power. They built massive walls around the city of Rhodes, turning it into one of the most impregnable fortresses in the Mediterranean. Their navy patrolled the seas, attacking Muslim pirates, defending Christian merchants, and, to be frank, engaging in piracy of their own. The fall of the Templars and the rise of the Hospitallers. In 1312, the world changed again. Pope Clement V, under pressure from King Philip IV of France, dissolved the Templar order after a series of brutal trials and executions. The Templars' wealth and lands were confiscated, and much of it transferred to the Hospitallers. Overnight, the Knights of St. John became the richest and most powerful military order in Christendom. They inherited not only the Templars' estates, but also their reputation disciplined, fearless, and proud. They were now the sole remaining knightly order with both spiritual and military authority. A new war, the Ottoman threat, but the world around them was changing fast. The Ottoman Empire was rising, a vast and disciplined Muslim power that would soon threaten all of Europe. The Knights found themselves on the front line once again. In 1480, the Ottomans, under Sultan Mehmed II, who had conquered Constantinople just 27 years earlier, launched a massive assault on Rhodes. 70,000 Ottoman soldiers surrounded the island, facing only 7,000 knights and local defenders. For weeks, the knights held their ground. The city's walls thundered with cannon fire. Towers fell and were rebuilt overnight. The Grand Master, Pierre d'Aubusson, fought beside his men, wounded several times but refusing to yield. When the siege finally broke, the Ottomans withdrew, leaving thousands of their dead behind. Rhodes had survived. Europe rejoiced. The knights were hailed as heroes of Christendom, the shield of the West. But their victory could not last forever. The Ottoman Empire was vast, patient, and relentless. The fall of Rhodes and the search for a new home. In 1522, a new Ottoman Sultan, Suleiman the Magnificent, returned to finish what his grandfather had begun. This time, he brought an army of 200,000 men and a fleet of 400 ships. The knights, under Grand Master Philippe de Villiers de l'Isle Adam, numbered barely 7,000 again. The siege lasted 6 months. Cannon fire reduced the once great walls of Rhodes to rubble. The defenders fought street by street, house by house, until finally, in December 1522, with the city in ruins and his men exhausted, the Grand Master surrendered. But Suleiman admired their courage. In an act rare for the age, he allowed the surviving knights to leave with their arms, their banner, and their honor intact. They departed Rhodes on the 1st of January 1523, their destination uncertain. For years, the order wandered across Europe homeless, sovereign without land. Kings offered them temporary refuge, but none would grant them a permanent home. It seemed the Knights Hospitaller might fade into history, a relic of the Crusades. Then came a gift, one that would change everything. The gift of Malta. In 1530, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V offered the Knights a new base, the islands of Malta and Gozo, along with the North African port of Tripoli. In return, the order would pay a symbolic rent each year, a single falcon, presented to the Viceroy of Sicily. The Knights accepted. On the 26th of October 1530, the Hospitallers arrived at Malta, a rocky, windswept island, barren and small, but perfectly positioned in the center of the Mediterranean. From there, they could strike against Ottoman fleets and Barbary pirates while guarding Christian trade routes. They fortified their new home with the same skill they had shown on Rhodes, building massive stone bastions that seemed to rise straight out of the sea. The capital, Birgu, became their citadel. The order's flag, a white cross on a red field, flew proudly over the harbor. And then, in 1565, came the moment that would define them forever. The Great Siege of Malta, 1565, Suleiman the Magnificent, enraged by decades of raids on his ships, sent an invasion force to crush the knights once and for all. 40,000 Ottoman soldiers, led by the best commanders of the empire, landed on Malta to face just 9,000 defenders, including 500 knights and a few thousand Maltese militia. The siege lasted from May to September 1565. The Ottomans bombarded the fortresses of Street Elmo, Street Angelo, and Birgu day and night. Fort Street Elmo fell only after a month, its defenders fighting to the last man. The knights fought with a mix of faith and fury. The Maltese peasants joined them, turning every stone into a weapon. When the Ottoman assault finally broke and their fleets retreated, Malta was a wasteland of smoke and ash. But Europe rejoiced once again. The knights had done the impossible. They had stopped the greatest army on earth. The victory at Malta became one of the great legends of European history, a moment when courage, faith, and stone walls turned back an empire. In gratitude, Pope Pius IV called the knights the shield of Christendom. The Grand Master, Jean Parisot de Valette, became a hero. He began building a new city, a fortress of stone and faith which still bears his name today, Valletta, the capital of Malta. From humble healers to rulers of an island fortress, the Knights Hospitaller had carved out a kingdom in the sea. They were no longer merely servants of the sick. They were princes, admirals, and warriors. But their power, like all earthly empires, would not last forever. Part 3. From Empire to Symbol, 17th Century, Today. By the dawn of the 17th century, the Knights Hospitaller stood at the height of their glory. Their gleaming city of Valletta, carved from the limestone cliffs of Malta, was a marvel of its age, a fortress and a sanctuary, crowned with cathedrals, palaces, and hospitals. Its massive bastions, built after the Great Siege of 1565, seemed eternal, rising proudly above the grand harbor. But history has a way of humbling even the proudest of warriors. The world was changing. and with it, the purpose of the Knights of Malta. The Golden Age of Valletta. For over a century after their great victory, the order ruled Malta as a small but fiercely independent state. The Grand Masters styled themselves as princes, their authority recognized across Europe. They minted their own coins, flew their red and white flag on ships, and maintained diplomatic ties with kings and popes alike. Under Grand Masters like Olaf de Vignacourt, 1601–1622, Malta flourished. The knights built aqueducts, hospitals, and schools. Their navy, the Order's galleys, continued to patrol the Mediterranean, attacking Ottoman corsairs and freeing Christian captives. Valletta became both a fortress and a beacon of European culture. Artists like Caravaggio found refuge there, and his masterpiece, The Beheading of St. John the Baptist, still hangs in the co-cathedral that bears the saint's name, the same saint who had inspired the order centuries before. The Knights' Hospital, the Sacra Infermaria, was among the finest in Europe, with long marble halls and individual beds for patients, a rare luxury at the time. Even enemies of the order were treated there, reflecting the Knights' enduring vow of charity. The decline of the Knights, yet beneath the glory, cracks began to form. The 17th century saw the slow decline of both chivalry and religious warfare. The rise of powerful nation-states, France, Spain, and England, left little room for a small religious order to wield influence. The Ottoman Empire, though still formidable, no longer posed the existential threat it once did. The knights, who had once lived by strict vows of poverty and discipline, grew comfortable in their palaces. Many were noblemen more concerned with prestige than faith. The galleys of Malta, once feared across the sea, became ceremonial relics. By the 18th century, the order's power had faded into pageantry. The age of the Crusades was over. The age of revolution was about to begin. Napoleon comes to Malta. In 1798, a young general named Napoleon Bonaparte, on his way to conquer Egypt, arrived with a fleet before the walls of Valletta. The Grand Master, Ferdinand von Hompesch, found himself facing the most modern army in Europe. The knights, bound by their vows not to fight fellow Christians, were divided and unprepared. Napoleon demanded entry. Hompesch hesitated. Within days, the French seized control of Malta without a major battle. The order that had resisted the might of the Ottoman Empire fell to diplomacy and confusion. Napoleon abolished the order's rule, seized its treasures, and sailed on to Egypt, leaving behind a broken legacy. The once mighty Knights Hospitaller were now exiles again, scattered across Europe. Their fleet was gone, their fortress occupied. Malta would soon pass into British hands, and the order seemed doomed to vanish into history. Exile and survival. Yet, astonishingly, the order survived. In 1799, Tsar Paul I of Russia, a devout admirer of the Knights, offered them refuge in St. Petersburg. Though a controversial figure, he briefly accepted the title of Grand Master, despite not being Catholic. His patronage saved the order from extinction, giving it new legitimacy and protection. Throughout the 19th century, the Knights of St. John transformed once again, returning to their original mission of healing and charity. No longer warriors, they became healers once more. They established hospitals, medical missions, and charitable works across Europe and the Mediterranean. The white eight-pointed Maltese cross, once worn on armor, now appeared on doctors' coats and relief wagons. The order in the modern era, by the 20th century, the Sovereign Military Order of Malta, as it is formally known, had become a unique entity, a state without territory, a nation without borders. It maintains diplomatic relations with over 100 countries and holds permanent observer status at the United Nations. Its headquarters, the Palazzo Magistrale in Rome, enjoys extraterritorial rights, much like a small sovereign state. Today, the Order's 13,000 members, along with tens of thousands of volunteers, continue their 1,000-year mission of service. They operate hospitals, refugee camps, and disaster relief operations around the world. From the battlefields of Syria to the earthquake zones of Haiti, the red flag with the white cross still flies, not as a banner of war, but as a symbol of mercy. The Knights' modern motto, Tuitio fidei et obsequium pauperum, defense of the faith and service to the poor, reflects their evolution, from swords to stethoscopes, from fortresses to field hospitals. Legacy of 1,000 years. The story of the Knights Hospitaller, the Knights of Malta, is a mirror of Western history itself. Faith and power, glory and decline, fall and rebirth. Few institutions have endured for nearly a millennium. Fewer still have transformed so completely. They began as monks in Jerusalem, tending to the sick. They became warriors, defending the Holy Land and the seas. They ruled an island, fought an empire, and then lost it all. And yet, they endured adapting, surviving, and serving anew. The eight-pointed Maltese cross remains one of the world's oldest living symbols, each point said to represent a virtue. Faith, charity, justice, truth, prudence, temperance, resolution, and humility. Perhaps that is the true lesson of their long journey. That strength alone fades, but faith and service endure. And so, nearly 1,000 years after the first brothers tended pilgrims in Jerusalem, the Knights of Malta still stand, not with swords in hand, but with open hearts, carrying on the oldest battle of all, the fight to heal a wounded world.